Welcome to The Art of Growth. I'm Joel Hubbard.
And I'm Jim Zartman, and we are talking through the instincts, taking a deep dive. And today we're going to be talking about what instinct is needed now. This is a chapter from the book called Hunters, Farmers, and Teamers. Essentially what we're saying is there's a different time that each of these instincts need to lead. And then we want to talk a little bit about the cost of when they're missing. And in the blind spots episode, we talked a little bit about the cost of if it missing at the individual level. But we're going to talk a little bit about the wider level. But we want to start with this idea of like, well, what one is needed now, that there's a different instinct needed for different seasons.
Yeah. Well, let's be idealistic for a moment. Is it supposed to be all three instincts? Always making
equally
decisions?
All the time?
All the time?
Yeah, not so much.
No? So everybody gets like a 33.3% vote?
Right.
Okay, so that doesn't work.
No.
You know, you said in another podcast, you said we're in the wisdom industry. So I think that's so important because so much of what's being peddled out there are sort of like, here's the answer to the problem.
Yeah.
Everybody's in the business of doing that these days. It's like
it's the answer industry.
We're in the answer industry. I've never seen so many people posting answers to questions on social media. And the majority of it is really bad because it's like you're applying a specific situational response and you've turned it into a universal answer to all problems. And that's our attempt to make the questions smaller than our answers. And
ooh, that's a good phrase. Make our questions smaller than our answers.
Yeah.
Yeek. Okay. Sorry, carry on.
I mean, I have felt that viscerally. So that was a challenge for me in my own growth was, can I allow the questions to be bigger? Meaning I have small answers, but big questions. And that I found very difficult to pivot to that. If it's very uncertain when you live in that space. But that to me is part of what it means to be in the wisdom industry is it's not something that I take lightly at all. Something I take very, very seriously. It's a privilege, but it's also a burden, a calling to live deliberately to try your best to live into wisdom, to practice wisdom. But that's part of what it means is that I think our questions have to be bigger than our answers. And so that needs to guide how we move through the instincts. What are we doing right now? What is the best decision for this situation? I mean, when we ask those questions, when anybody ever asks that question, what's the best decision I should be making given what the options, given the current problems, given the current realities? What should I be doing here? We're asking the wisdom question. Whenever someone says what I love, whenever someone asks a big question to me, they say, how do I practice living into the instincts? Or how do I practice a good relationship to my instincts? It's like, well, now you've asked a big question, right? So I'm going to give small answers to that, but it's not answering the question.
No.
I want you to be comfortable as much as you can, uncomfortably comfortable with the fact that question is so big, it's going to require you living into it for the rest of your life. And that's actually a good North Star for us. What are the big questions that become our North Star? And I think one of them is what instinct is needed to be leveraged at any given time. Part of it, I think, is I'm going to suggest a couple things. One is the situation itself. What situation are you finding yourself in? So let's take a context of being in a social environment. When you walk into, say, someone's birthday party, or you're going to a wedding, or you're going to some kind of
networking
workshop event.
Sure.
What instinct is being called on in that space? Well, if we don't ask ourselves that question, we're going to go in there with our dominant instinct.
On default.
Right. And then we're going to find it to be awkward space. But yeah, situations require that. Say you're having to do some kind of project on the house, or when springtime finally rolls around, and what are people going to be doing around here in New England? Well, a lot of projects, right? People are going to start cleaning up, doing all that. So what instinct is required when that happens? When people are starting to think about, relationships, dating, that kind of thing, what instinct is required in developing a romantic connection with somebody? It's not the farmer instinct. It's not entirely the teamer instinct at that point. It's calling on something else. And we kind of know that, but yet at the same time, there's a resistance sometimes, a resistance to doing that. So when I talk to people without one of these instincts, usually that's the question I ask is, how comfortable are you? Could you imagine yourself practicing that instinct? How would it look if you did that? And that's oftentimes the questions, those type of questions really cause people to wake up to, oh, it is inside me, but really dormant or, undeveloped. So I would categorize one of them as situational. I think that is a helpful guide to which instinct, is necessary.
For those of you who are trying to fit these categories in your mind, we're talking about that hunter instinct that will pursue the new. It'll have that competitive risk-taking element of willing to approach someone, willing to
self-disclose,
yeah. To share about who you are, to both pursue and attract, whether an individual or attention or an opportunity. We're talking about the farmer instinct, the ability to sustain and maintain and make use of resource management and to function well with what you have and strategize and organize, and that teamer instinct to come together, to have a shared experience, to be a part of something bigger than yourself, to work with others. And there's a time for each of those. And when you're talking about, even in the dating, the beginning part may have that hunter sexual instinct where you're trying to attract or pursue or attract, but it's going to need at some point, you're going to need to check in with that teamer instinct. Like, how does this person fit in with my friends and me and with them friends, and meeting each other's families and being part of a wider network? And if we're going to build something together, we're going to build a sustainable life together. We're going to need to bring some practicality into this mix and ask some hard questions. And how do we actually heal so we don't self-destruct this union that we're trying to build? So it's going to require all the different stages of the relationship, the instincts are, but there's a different time that each of them come into play. We talk about a chapter in the book where when companies are being built, a lot of times the launch of a company has a lot of that hunter instinct. It sees that, as Peter Thiel talks about, the 0 to 1. There's something that does not exist, and we're not competing with another market. We're trying to make something new.
Yeah.
We're pursuing a new opportunity. We see something that hasn't been done or hasn't been brought to a wide market, and we're going to pursue this opportunity, go for it. A lot of that hunter instinct functioning right there. That's that startup phase. But then you've got to move into this stabilization phase, and you're going to need to bring the farmers on. Yeah. And they're going to need to create the systems and the structures and the supply chains and the infrastructure behind the scenes to make it a stable business so that the opportunity can actually have the infrastructure to be able to function. But if you stop there, you can't scale without that teamer instinct. And that teamer instinct comes for the scalability. So you don't become overly siloed, that you're still able to keep the pursuing opportunities and you're creating the stability, that everyone is working together, that you're acquiring new talent. You're seeing what else is emerging on the market scene that could be a competitor, that could be a company that you might want to buy out because it's going to add to what you already do. There's a movement that every company has to go through to go from startup to stabilization to scalability. And you have to ask the question, like, well, what instinct is needed now so that we maintain stability? And we know that companies crumble, even some of the giants throughout history. And when you look at what happened, we understand, we can look at it and say, well, I can tell you which instinct was missing.
Yeah.
And that's what happened.
Yeah. So that's the thing with viability for organizations. At a certain point, you started at the hunter. And almost always when a hunter starts a company, there's going to be a farmer that they're going to do that with. Almost always. You almost never hear about a startup company that's only a bunch of hunters because there's an intuition around that, which is like, who's going to set up payroll?
Right.
So that's where the hunter finds a farmer. The farmer is excited about the opportunity to create something out of nothing, right? Because that's what farmers love to do. It's like, ooh.
Yeah, they can bring their gift.
I can make this thing really work. I can, You found something, yeah, that's great, and now I can take that and make it into something. They pair up well, and then if they do get to that point where they say, well, let's bring in some teamers now. We need people to the genius that comes from the synergy of a bunch of people working together and co-creating. And there's like this magic that happens when people come together.
Yeah.
They create something bigger than any one of them or even the sum of all the parts could have done. So it's really amazing what can take place. So they get to that where, wow, we're now really thriving. But at some point, the organization gets to that sort of plateauing, and why are we not continuing to grow? What's missing here? What instinct is missing here? And that can be situational. It can be like, well, are we reading what's going on in the larger world? And I think that's where it gets really tricky. It's not as obvious as when we're describing these early stages. Now, I say it's obvious, but yet for most of these startup companies, there is not the awareness of the instincts, which is why you and I hope to kind of replace a lot of these other personality systems that are being used because they're not addressing these fundamental. And what I mean, these other personality systems are good, but they're not fundamental. They're not foundational to who we are as humans. The instincts are. They're the most foundational of all of these. And so if we're not aware of them, they're still having significant impact, good or bad,
at both the individual and the organizational level. I think that's one of the biggest distinctions is none of these systems do both. And this really does show both.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So that's where we hope it helps a lot of these organizations. But then when you get to that place where you do have the teamer instinct there and you're doing teams, you've got all that going on, we still have gone into these larger companies where we can tell that all three have been used at some point. And yet, there's almost always one that is being ignored to the detriment of the organization.
Yeah.
Now, I want to say that, but I also want to say that it does not mean that this is a 33.3% allocation of all three instincts as a means to success. That's not what we're saying. We're not saying that's the math. What we're saying is you will always have, as any organization that's in, say, construction, will predominantly lead with the farmer instinct and should lead with the farmer instinct. In the world of finance and management of finance, and farmers should lead 100%. In the world of anything marketing or entrepreneurial, that should be more hunter. Yeah, we're going to see that more, and that's a good thing. Nonprofits usually at the very top anyways are led by people with a lot of teamer instinct in them to missional kind of mindset. These are also important. But almost always when we walk into these organizations, we say, yes, you need to value that. That's definitely your top. But there's a reason why you're struggling in this area. It's because you're trying to gain new business, but you're not leveraging the hunter.
Yeah.
That's your particular struggle right now. And I think that's something for organizations to pay attention to families to pay attention to churches, other nonprofits, social groups, all of that, to pay attention to what's the current problem that I'm facing. What instinct is it revealing as the one that's being marginalized, that's completely unseen at this point?
Right. Because this is the situation where we are creatures that every problem is a nail when all you have is a hammer. It does tend to be that way. We don't often ask the question, well, which instinct would be the best solution to our current problem? Because we tend to look at whatever our current problem is and then automatically assume that our instinct is a solution for it.
Mm-hmm.
This is why you see some companies are really good at finding new clientele, but they don't serve them that well, and so they constantly have to look for new clientele.
Yeah.
And there's other companies, they're really good at maintaining customers, maintaining loyal customers for years and years and years, but those customers just keep aging, and they don't bring on new ones.
Yep.
So if they don't have enough of that energy, they tend to falter over time. So it's what we're advocating for is being aware of the season you're in as a family, as an organization, as a community, whatever it is, and understanding which instinct is the thing that's going to actually help propel you forward right now.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's going to be one of the three. It's all three.
Mm-hmm.
And when things go wrong, it's usually one of the three.
Yeah.
And so a lot of the cautionary tales that are out there in the world when they talk about business, the most famous ones are the ones where they point to where the hunter instinct was missing.
Yeah.
And I tell a couple of stories in the book. I tell the story about BlackBerry when they had the meeting and someone holds up an iPhone and they say, what are we going to do about this? And the response in the room was, that's not really what we do.
Yeah.
That's not really something for us to worry about. And I told, I think it was the last episode where I told the story about Nokia, where it was like they didn't address that. And that was a huge thing that was a market thing. But I also mentioned in the Nokia one that they didn't have enough of the teamer instinct. They were having different divisions compete against each other to make a product that they would bring to market. But the common thing that people talk about in the cautionary world is, oh, well, they didn't see the new opportunity and they didn't look at what was coming up. And so they missed the boat and so they went under. And that absolutely happens. So we can talk about that, but we want to talk about the other versions too.
Yeah.
Because that is a problem. And that is a problem right now with different companies that we see, that they don't remind people that they exist. They don't look for new opportunities. They stay so close to the tried and true or what has worked before. Well, this is how we've always done it. Those are the kinds of things that get advocated for. And when we hear that, we cringe a little bit because you're like, oh, we're missing some of that hunter instinct.
Right.
Whenever we hear, well, this is just what we've always done.
Yeah.
Whenever you hear that, you know, oh, there's a real lack of that hunter instinct, which means eventually this will stop working.
Yeah. I think you've nailed it. That's a big part of what we see that's obvious to so many. It's like, oh, yeah, that's the missing instinct, right? You didn't have that. It's obvious to us because, well, I lead with the hunter instinct. So for me, that's always been clear to me. It's never been a mystery to me when that's missing. I see it even before anyone else in the organization sees it. I remember sharing this in a church when I was a youth pastor. The lead pastor asked me, well, he could see it in me. He didn't know the instincts, but he knew, he recognized there was something. He's like, you know what? Tell me what you would do. What's your vision? And I wrote down 10 things. I do not remember doing this. But years later, one of the pastors at the church I ran into, he said to me, hey, do you remember the time you wrote down those 10 things about the changes that needed to be made to the church? And I said, I do not remember any of that. Because again, as a hunter, it's like, that's constantly on my mind. Sure. There's a lot of them. Well, he said, you wrote them down. It's your name and everything. We got it. Well, do you know that we've implemented all those changes? Well, it's taken years for us to do it, but we've implemented all those changes. And wow, it just was like, well, that felt really good to know that, that helped them. What it reminded me of was, in this moment, was how that was so clear to me years ago, but not clear to the organization. And it wouldn't be immediately. But eventually they did move in that direction and began to implement those changes, which benefited them. And that is something that that instinct is obvious to those who have it, and they'll be the ones speaking up. So if you're in an organization and you're hearing the hunter types saying this is what needs to be, it's not that you have to do all of those things. Right. It's just that, okay, pay attention, listen, because they're going to intuit things earlier than the majority of people are around what changes are needed for an organization. I bet at Nokia, I bet at BlackBerry, I bet at Blockbuster, I bet there were hunters on the board
saying,
or or C-level people who were saying, guys, folks were missing this opportunity here. And so I think that that's an important thing to do, is to pay attention to that. Yeah, that's the one that we could see very clearly because they're bigger, and so they're notable. But when you're talking about the farmer instinct that's missing in certain organizations, many of them never get to that size.
Yeah, they don't have the structure in place to even get big enough to we hear about them. A lot of the stories about not having enough farmer instinct and that what took out the company, this is a lot of startups that had a lot of capital, but it burned out really quickly. Like most people wouldn't even recognize the names, like Juicero, that had like $100 million as a startup. Jeez. There was a ton of startup around that. There was another one which was a streaming service. I told the story in the book where Netflix goes to Blockbuster and they offer to sell themselves for $50 million to Blockbuster, and Blockbuster laughed them out of the room because they were huge. And now Blockbuster is bankrupt. There's actually one left. I didn't know this until recently. There's one store. Netflix is now worth over $300 billion. There was another streaming service called Quibi that started up. They raised $2 billion to start up, and they went under. Wow. They just didn't have the structure in place. And so the thing that actually people would have probably heard about where this was a problem was the dot-com era.
Yeah,
so
for sure.
With the dot-com era, there was a ton of hunter energy. There were people who were selling, websites and business plans for insane money before they had ever made a single thing. They didn't even exist, and they were selling. So it was literally just an idea that was selling that had no structure in place.
Wow.
But one of the famous ones that went under was Pets.com. So they were part of that dot-com bubble. They were a huge company, but they spent more on marketing than infrastructure. So they were famous. So we know about them. We've heard of them.
Yeah.
But they couldn't control their supply chains. They didn't have the personnel infrastructure in place. So because they didn't have any of the stuff that creates long-term stability and success, they crashed like 2 years later.
Wow.
So these are massive companies. People would have been like, oh my goodness, this is so cool. You're part of this amazing opportunity. Yeah. And it was an amazing opportunity. They were way ahead on the game.
Yeah.
My neighborhood, you always are seeing these Chewy boxes, Chewy is a company that sells pet supplies that show up at your door. This could have been that company, but because they spent more on marketing than infrastructure, they went under. They didn't put the stabilization in place of that farmer instinct.
Yeah. And that is such a good illustration of that. Again, farmers would have been there saying, hey, we need to solve this problem. But as we did in the previous podcast around when instincts collide, who's listening? Who's hearing the people in supply chain saying, we got to solve this problem or we are not going to make it?
Yeah. It doesn't matter. You can get 100 million orders, but if you can't fill them, those people will never buy from you again.
Right.
And your company goes under. That's it. That's all she wrote.
Yeah.
And that's what happened. That is a thing. And then the lack of the teamer instinct. So we mentioned a little bit in the last episode about how where we see this start happening is companies get, often when they're getting really large, so they become overly siloed. They have departments working really interdependent from each other, and they end up going down because there's no shared vision. There's no consistency. People often talk about one of the geniuses of Apple is they actually stripped away most of their products in the early 2000s in order to focus, or even in the late 90s, to focus on the iMac. And then they introduced the iPod a few years later. But they were very specific about only having certain projects, not having too many products. And they built like the right things at the right time, at the right pace. As opposed to a huge name in that era was Xerox. So Xerox, they introduced like the computer mouse, that was them, graphic cards, Ethernet cables, but they were so siloed in all of these different divisions, there wasn't like a shared mission. And so it was almost like these different parts were operating independently, and the left hand did not know what the right hand was doing. So it ended up being like companies like Apple and Microsoft that capitalized on their technology, bought stuff out from under them and then used them to build a stable company that they are. But then what happened to Xerox? Like, I never hear that name anymore.
Yeah.
But they were huge leaders in the front of all this stuff.
Yeah.
But because of the siloing and the communication, they didn't make it.
And again, there were teamers undoubtedly there saying, hey, we got the wrong people in the wrong places. We're not listening to each other.
If you put this with this, you'd really have something.
Yeah.
Like they could have been making computers that were huge because they built so much of the technology that did it.
Yeah.
But like they're a shell, Same with the Nokia that we mentioned before. They're a shell because they had all of these different parts competing with each other.
Yeah. When a farmer says, I realize that we've been farming the land too much. We need something new. We need something fresh here. There's a place for the hunter to enter in. And the hunter now has a direction. Instead of the hunter just being like, well, I just want to go out and hunt. Now we can reverse that and say, when a hunter is going out to hunt, because there's an intuition around, there's something different here. We need to really pay attention to that. And the hunter goes to hunt and then says to the farmer, hey, you know what? We've been doing the same old. This is really important as a significant shift in the industry. And the farmer says, you know what? You're right. Let's pivot and let's create new sustainable systems, processes to serve that.
Yeah.
Right. The teamer recognizes like, man, it's great. We've got a lot of people. They all like to work for each other. They enjoy this. We're all connected. We've got great people in the right places, but we need to have processes put in place here. And it might mean that some of these people are in different roles or in different parts of the, I might lose some people. Some people might end up somewhere else. When we're doing that, I think that's where the intersection between the instincts can play a significant role, because otherwise the hunter can lose the intuition around what's the thing I should be hunting. And then they realize they're not succeeding at the hunt anymore. Or the farmer is farming and it's producing less and less and less. And then they get disillusioned by their own farming.
Or they make it so weighed down with so much red tape.
Oh my gosh.
That's one thing that can happen if that's overly used. Yeah, that can happen.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the same thing for the teamer, that you get in the right people and so on, but you don't have a compelling drive or direction that you're all hunting in that aim, or or you don't have processes in place that give the team the security that they're actually needing, the sense of, this is stable, this is a solid structure, I can be here for a while. And the funny thing about it is then the teamer would also lose the sense that the teamer instinct is really working well. So all of us, our instincts are not designed to work in silos effectively. That's where we notice a drop-off in productivity that happens naturally through that instinct. All three instincts can be highly productive if there's an intersection, if they're listening well and picking up on where that instinct could serve the other instincts. And if they're all thinking that way, now you've got real harmony going on.
That's really good. If I was going to give someone a main takeaway, it's, can you tune into what is required of the moment, and how good are you at listening to the people who naturally bring that?
Yeah.
You had added a great section to the book that's just, questions to ask of each of the instincts so that you can bring forward what they have to offer. One of the companies that we've worked with who are having a bit of this silo issue, they did have some transitions, and they started asking, don't just ask, how does this help your team, but start asking yourself the question, how does this help in the light of the vision of the whole company? And so they're asking the right questions. Whether they'll go about it, that's a long road, but that's at least putting the right question, the big question, as you were saying. Are we asking the big question that can actually lead us to that? And so,
incentives, right? We have to, organizations, you have to change some of your incentives, because you have the company by design. It really is. We could say it's by default, but you know what? It is also by the design of your own instinctual stacking, your own personality type. I mean, you watch this. It's like the incentive is, we want to be team. I remember this in one of the organizations we were working on. Oh yeah, we want to be team, unified, one goal, one vision. It's like, and then the incentives are, each team leader would be evaluated by the productivity of their own team. Okay, great. How does that help the collaboration between the teams in the aim towards the larger goal of the organization succeeding in their mission? And they couldn't answer that. I literally asked one of the directors, I said, so you're saying that the president is saying that he wants everybody aligned towards the larger vision and larger goal, and you want to work cross teams, you want to work in collaboration? Where's the incentive for that? If the incentive is you're going to get your pay raise, you're going to get promoted if you succeed as a director over your own team. And you know what the response was? Literally like laughter. And you're seeing what we're seeing for sure. Yeah. It's not hidden on us that the incentives are wrong.
Because maybe this is something every company needs to face. Maybe you're company is functioning exactly as you've designed it to.
Oh, yeah.
And it's this incentivization is a major issue. Like, what are you incentivizing?
Yeah.
Because that's going to produce exactly the results that you're getting right now.
Oh, yeah. Oh, and on the same team, it was funny because I was talking to a teamer. She's dominant teamer instinct. And she says, you know what my feedback was, my 360? That I need to self-promote. I'm not promoting. I'm not doing enough self-promotion.
Oh, yeah.
And she was like, and I frankly have no appetite for that whatsoever. And it came from her boss.
Who's probably great at that.
Who's great at that.
And then advocating for their value system onto the other person.
Yeah. It's like,
right.
Here's how you want to respond to that. So I laid it out. It's like, judge me by the success of the team. If the team achieves the goals and does so, we do what we've laid out,
really good.
Then judge me by that. Because I am going to succeed in my ambition. You want me to be more ambitious? Well, here's my ambition. I love it when the team succeeds. And I'm driven to making that happen. And she was like, I own that. I own that 100%. That is me. So
this is where we talk about you can't motivate people if you don't know what motivates them.
Absolutely.
And so he's literally saying you should be motivated by something that doesn't motivate you.
But what motivates me?
You should be motivated by what motivates me.
Yeah.
So talk about setting someone up for failure.
Yeah. Yeah.
And not getting the best out of them. You want to get the best out of someone? Pull on their actual internal motivations.
Yes.
So are you utilizing the instinct in the way that it should show up in this time? And are you incentivizing for the benefit of that instinct?
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It seems so simple when we say it like that, but I just don't think there's been something as simple as this to kind of spell all this out.
No, and it isn't, look, by no means is this simple. What we're saying is if you start with the awareness around the instincts, knowledge around the instincts, and you start by practicing these sort of questions around the instincts. What is missing here? What instinct is missing? This problem that we're facing, this opportunity that we're facing, what instinct is it requiring? What instinct is it pointing to?
Yeah.
And you start practicing some of these things we're talking about. Over time, you'll notice a shift. And we're not talking about over time, meaning like over years. We're talking about you will notice an immediate shift, but then you'll start to see progressively if you stay on that note. Well, unfortunately, a lot of organizations, it's like, okay, we did that. On to the next. It's like, well, I get that because I'm a hunter, but you know what? This is one of those that you can't get there by just trying it once. You have to practice it on a regular basis. The three instincts. What is missing? What instinct is required? What are these people saying around me? How are they speaking through the instincts? Am I listening to that? I think that if you're listening and you're practicing these skills, that immediately you'll notice a shift, but over time, your organization, your family system, your church, your nonprofit, all of these things will start to succeed and sustain success over time.
Right, and that's the goal that we're advocating for. We want to ask, how can you use this to make things as sustainable as possible? And by sustainable, that means that there's an element of growth that are happening, you're having new opportunities, and that you're working together. Because this is not just the path to success, it's the path to satisfaction, which is I think, a bigger motivator for us, which is something we talk about. Like, we want people to value themselves, value others, and relate well. Yeah. Because if you do all three of those things, then you're going to have more success and sustainability and satisfaction in what you do. It's that trifecta that we want to advocate for and support. This is why we love working with teams. And if you have a team that you think that this would benefit from, or you'd want us to do a bit of an analysis around, like, that would be an absolute honor. We love doing that stuff. When I say simple, it's not simple to do, but it's simple to understand. Like most things in life,
that's
we
the
think
right
that
way to do it, right?
Right.
Simple.
Most people think that things are difficult to understand, and once we understand right, it'll be kind of easy to do. But the truth is, the things that actually change what's in front of you and change what needs to happen, often once you have a framework like this that makes sense, it's easy to understand, but then it's difficult to do. Yeah. So it's about, how do you apply that energy in the best way possible to make this happen? And so hopefully this framework gives you a little bit of we've done some stuff on the individual side, but really looking at the organizational side, the large organizational side, what's happening in and around you. This is an episode that you might want to send to your boss. You might want to send to their boss and say, just kind of look at this from a 30,000 foot view.
Yeah.
I'll try to make a succinct newsletter about this too, so people can share that, to go, this will help you understand on a grand scheme what can happen and what you need to apply in order to make sure that you are, again, not just having a successful company, but making a contribution that is here to stay and that people can benefit from for a long time.
Yeah. And we're not asking small organizations to suspend the work you're doing to do this deep dive that'll take hours away from your employees to focus on. And larger organizations, you can do that. It's a little easier for you to do that. But what we're saying is, no, bring us into the conversation first. Start with the conversation. And then we can actually take particular issues you're dealing with right now and work the model through it. And so there's no loss in time. You're actually dealing with the issue that's in front of you. That's what we believe in, is instead of like, hey, learn this new framework, learn this new tool. It's like, yeah, it's important to do that, but it's important to be able to immediately in the session begin to solve the complex challenges you're facing.
So thanks for listening. You can take the new Hunters, Farmers, and Teamers assessment on our website, theartofgrowth.org. That is our new instincts test. And you can order the Hunters, Farmers, and Teamers book on Amazon now. The link is in the show notes. Based on our interactions, we are also adding content to our Instagram about the topic, which is just Art of Growth. And the best way to support the show is to leave us a review wherever you listen and share this episode with someone else. We're hugely grateful for you doing this work with us. Grace and growth, my friends.